Hello, and welcome to the action plan presentation for the Officer Candidate School Mentoring Program proposal. My name is William Glick, and this is a presentation to satisfy requirements for EDUC 735 at Liberty University School of Education. So what we're going to talk about today is the identified performance gap that this program will close, the goal of the OCS mentoring program, key steps within the action plan that are going to be necessary to close the performance gap and accomplish the mentoring program. We'll talk about potential concerns and mitigation, and then finally we'll wrap up with a conclusion. So the identified performance gap. So the U.S. Coast Guard Leadership Development Center produces the majority of commissioned officers within the United States Coast Guard. The U.S. Coast Guard Academy produces just under half of the total number of officers in the Coast Guard. So the critical gap in the performance of new accessions or new hires has exhibited itself over the last few years at Officer Candidate School. So consider that the Coast Guard Academy takes generally young adults from out of high school and has 200 weeks or 4 years to transform them into officers and grant them a degree. On the other side, Officer Candidate School has 17 weeks to turn everybody from new hires right out of college who already have their degrees to prior enlisted people with up to 15 years of service. So the folks that are coming in right out of college generally have not been performing at the level of those that are more seasoned. So that right now is the critical gap in the performance of our students. The lack of specific structured mentoring programs. So we have many informal mentoring programs, including the class sponsor program, which is an informal relationship between typically a flag officer or admiral and the students. They meet periodically throughout the time of the class. We have leadership philosophy mentors and assignment process mentors. So these are generally semi-structured mentorship programs, which are not necessarily the same amount of structure that provide students with general day-to-day support. However, the U.S. Coast Guard Academy employs members at the Loy Institute for Leadership within the grounds of the Coast Guard Academy Alumni Association building, and they've developed a very robust mentorship program for their cadets. And we'll talk about how they did that and how we can apply the same best practices that they use to Officer Candidate School. So the goal, we already talked about the goal, but we're going to try and close the performance gap of new accessions, that is new hires at Coast Guard Officer Candidate School. So the program is looking to provide quality structured mentoring to new accessions from seasoned members of the class prior to reporting. So this is a recommendation to provide a structured peer mentoring program before the students even show up in order to answer any questions or any gaps or any concerns that the less seasoned students may have. We need to measure and analyze the need of the program in order to justify future funding. So all of the action plan items that we're going to encounter today are not actually requiring any funding. However, it may justify future funding for more robust software to carry out some algorithms or pairing methodology that we're going to look to use in this program. There's also a community of practice for this. So 2 studies that form the basis of the peer mentoring program that we're looking to implement here at OCS, or that I'm proposing we should implement, are O'Connor et al. In 2018 and Redmond Gutke in 2020. Both of these studies came up with best practices for developing a robust mentoring program, including handbook for both mentors and mentees, along with additional structured portions which are covered more in depth in the written assignments submitted for this class in the action plan. So the early critical steps in carrying out this program is gaining institutional approval through the Coast Guard's IRB, or Institutional Review Board. So anytime we do a social experiment, we need to have informed consent as well as a prospectus for carrying out the experiment. So that's going to be that is definitely the first step that we're going to use prior to going into the next ones. Developing a standard operating procedure for the program and indeed a handbook for mentors and mentees once we get approval to conduct an experiment. And they're probably going to want to see that as well. Attaining a list of students. So once we gain approval from the Institutional Review Board and the command of the Coast Guard Leadership Development Center, they're going to look to get that list of students early on, approximately 2 months out prior to the students reporting aboard. That way we have time to pair them up. And then we're going to set up logistics for holding pre and post programmatic mentor meetings. So we'll talk to the master scheduler, then ensure that we have time set aside to conduct our semi-structured interviews at the end. So those are our first critical steps in the early part of carrying out this program in our action plan. Once we have the list of students, we'll pair them using an algorithm and best practices, which were taken from the cadet mentorship program at the Coast Guard Academy's Loy Institute for Leadership. And that'll be explained in more detail in the research paper, which will follow this. Academia in the field of research, so I already touched on the 2 studies, but generally we're looking to provide structure which research supports, produces a more robust and higher satisfaction rates of mentors and both mentees. Once we have them paired, we're going to link them together via trackable spreadsheet. We'll do that by starting off the kickoff time. So we'll send out a kickoff message and inform the students of their pairs. Once we have that, about 7 days after that, we'll hold a virtual kickoff meeting with the students and discuss the expectations of the program. We'll go over the handbook, and they'll also have a chance to submit their student agreements and contracts to cover any legal concerns that may come up. And of course, there will probably be questions that I can't answer for everybody at that time, but approximately 3 days after we have our kickoff virtual meeting, we'll follow up with the parking lot questions, the questions that I could not answer at the beginning of the kickoff meeting. We'll get that to the students afterwards. And the program will then be executed approximately a month and a half prior to the students reporting in. So that's the whole basis, is closing that performance gap. We keep coming back to that. So the end goal is to close that performance gap, and they'll have a month to do so, to talk to their student mentee or mentor, to link up and help them, the newest sessions, bring them up to speed prior to reporting in. 2 weeks into the program, so once we go live at Officer Candidate School, we'll have a informal session with the students, a very informal session to gauge the program's success. We'll conduct a SWOT analysis, or strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to the program, and we'll talk about, hey, what's going well, what's not going well, what are your initial reactions to this program, has the program helped you? We'll conduct a qualitative analysis. So at the end of the program, right before the students graduate, so approximately 2 weeks before they graduate, we'll be conducting the reactionary surveys, which will be in written format. It'll be conducted by me. And we'll also conduct semi-structured group interviews to see how the students did in terms of, hey, how did everything go? How did you think the program went? What are your thoughts? How effective was it, etc.? And then we'll gather data. We'll prepare for the analysis by gathering data. So how did the students who participated in the program versus those who did not participate in the program, how did they perform in terms of the metrics at the program? Whether they have higher or lower evals if they participated in the program? Did they have higher or lower test scores in the program than those that did not participate? And we'll determine which data is appropriate for the study. Then once we have that, we'll follow up with the Institutional Review Board and the Leadership Development Center, or LDC, command when we're complete, saying, hey, experiment is complete, we're analyzing the results. The analysis and follow-up, so looking at the performance data, saying, how effective was this, running regressions, etc. That will be conducted by me. Again, none of these cost anything except for my own time. So reviewing results via qualitative analysis, so looking at the results of the semi-structured interviews, identifying trends, and using the skills that will be learned later from the research methods classes coming up here in my program. I'll conduct an internal needs assessment of the program. So what were the positives? What were the areas for improvement overall, and what may future tools be needed? So submitting a report, once I have all that finalized, submitting a report to the Institutional Review Board and the Coast Guard's Office of Leadership, saying, hey, this was effective, this was not effective. So that'll be our analysis and follow-up. So potential concerns. So try to think ahead and think, what would my supervisor or the Institutional Review Board be concerned about? So legal concerns. So we're having students mentor other students, very seasoned students versus students who are not mentored. That would be the proposal. So that would be a concern, right? So making sure that students understand that, hey, you definitely do not have power over another student. It's it's a structured mentoring program, but it is not mentorship is not a form of authority of one person over another. So carrying out the program as well, what are some issues that could arise or disputes between students that would be a concern. Technology concerns, so discussion would rise. Hey, we may not have a good platform, so how are the students going to communicate? What are we going to do about students that are paired that may be in different time zones? So the Coast Guard's a global organization. What if I have somebody in Hawaii and then I have somebody on the other side of the world in Europe? How are they going to communicate? So mitigating those concerns. So we anticipate the concerns and now we look to mitigate them. So legal concerns, right? So we talked about the potential conflict between students. So have Coast Guard legal or Coast Guard Judge Advocate Generals or JAG review a contractual agreement or student-informed consent agreement. So we'll have the students sign something saying, I understand that I don't have power over another student. This is simply to help them. And that this is an informed consent saying that I understand. I am willing to be part of this experiment. I am willing to take part in this. So that'll mitigate the legal concern of that, carrying out the program. And then there's something happens. Look, we kind of covered our basis here. We have these documents which were reviewed by Coast Guard Legal, which say that this is good to go. That'll also help us gain approval with the Institutional Review Board. Technology concerns. So using the best practices that the Lloyd's Institute for Leadership is used. What have they used? How have they mitigated these concerns? So using those lessons learned from our field subject matter expert, which was conducted earlier in this class. Finally, differing time zones. So discuss and lay out expectations for students to meet. So the only virtual meeting that we'll have that is required to be held at a centrally located time will be the kickoff meeting. But after that, it's up to the students to meet the amount of times that they have to meet in order to get ready for the program and support the mentee. And finally, ensuring staff are available to mitigate concerns among students. So making sure that I'm available to answer any questions throughout the course of the program as we go through will help mitigate that technology concern. And we can find ways to mitigate those gaps through email, text message, phone call, or other means. So what we did today, we identified the performance gap. In order to close that performance gap, which is the generally lower performance or expressed perceived lower performance of the newest sessions at Coast Guard Officer Candidate School, how are we going to close that gap? We're going to develop an OCS mentoring program. We talked about the key steps within the action plan, from gaining approval to conduct the experiment all the way up to analysis and follow-up. And we talked about potential concerns and mitigation. And finally, here are the references that we discussed earlier. They are provided here from academic journals. So finally, this presentation is not the views of the Coast Guard. This is for an academic assignment, and this may be